Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Holly Nigorizawa. I'm the International Programs Director here in the International Office. I help out with programs and also help process H-1B cases, J-1 cases, and also serve as a primary liaison with HR. We're happy to be joined today by a few of our partners and also folks within the ISSO. Shaquita, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for including me in today's presentation, Holly. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shaquita Allen. I'm the Assistant Dean for Postdoctoral Affairs. We have an office on campus in the Rudder Center, and we support our over 1,100 postdoctoral research scholars in many different areas of work life and career development. And I am one of your strongest advocates on campus, and we look forward to supporting you, whether you're here now or you're coming in soon, and sharing the many, many resources that are available to postdoctoral scholars here. It is a vibrant and thriving postdoc community, and we develop and deliver many different types of programs and activities in support of postdocs, in addition to helping with policies and procedures. So welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you in any of the areas of your postdoc experience where we can support you.
Thank you, Shaquita and Cynthia.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Cynthia. I'm with the ISSO. I'm their assistant. I help with H-1B document collection as well as some programming. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Cynthia. We also have Brian Coe on the back end. He's helping us take care of tech. So thank you, Brian. And before we get started, I wanted to be sure to take care of a few housekeeping items. The first is that this workshop will be recorded, and it'll be available to you in about 1 to 2 weeks. We're going to do a little bit of editing just to make sure it's as we would like it. It will be about an hour of presentation with Q&A to follow. We know that a number of you have submitted questions in advance, and we've shared them with Jeff. And he will likely go and answer them throughout the presentation. And if not, you can use the Q&A chat function to submit them, and we'll work through them either throughout the workshop or, I'm sorry, work throughout the workshop on the back end by text or chatting a response, or by answering them live after Jeff presents. Um, as Shaquita mentioned, we partner very close with the postdoc office. We also partner very closely with the career office on campus at UCSF. We see ourselves as just close collaborators. Anytime anything comes up, we just jump in the same room and hammer things out. So you are very well supported here at UCSF. And I'm not sure if Shaquita mentioned, but of the 1,100 postdocs, we have about 60% that are international, very large population. And for folks who have joined us today, we not only have current international employees, which covers not only postdocs, but faculty members, visiting scholars, folks in those titles, but we also have folks who also haven't even entered the United States, which is what this workshop was intended for. It was for folks who have not entered the United States, who would like to know how to get their footing with financial literacy before they even enter the United States, because we know that there's a number of changes that you're going to be experiencing, and we want to make sure that you hit the ground running with just a framework to work with. Um, why financial literacy? Financial literacy is just really a way of managing your money. And it helps out with savings. It helps out with a number of different areas, building credit, things that Jeff will talk about, and just making smart financial choices, because you're going to be in a new country and it's all going to seem like it's flying at you very quickly. It'll help give you confidence, avoid mistakes with accruing debt. Again, building credit allows you to plan ahead through savings, especially if you want to start a family. And it helps also hopefully protect you against scams or bad deals. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jeff, who has a wonderful energy, super just I love how much energy you bring into the room, Jeff, and how much knowledge you have on this topic, and how you're able to just import that information to our international folks. So thank you for joining us today, Jeff. We appreciate you, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Holly, and it's certainly my pleasure to be participating in this webinar presentation today. I'm going to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint presentation that I will be using during the presentation, and I believe that it will be available to you to have a copy of the handout if you would like. As it was mentioned, this is being recorded. If you do have questions during the webinar, please submit the questions through the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we'll make sure we get to those questions at the end of the webinar. Just a little bit about myself. I have been working in the field of financial aid and in terms of personal finance and financial literacy and debt management for over 35 years. And I've actually been working with students and staff at UCSF probably for at least almost half of that time. Uh, and I do work currently as a consultant for the Office of Student Financial Services to provide assistance to currently enrolled students in helping them to understand how to pay for their education, how to manage their finances while at UCSF, and how to manage the repayment of any student loans they borrow after they graduate. But I also provide programming to postdocs and to students who are or individuals who are involved in the International Students and Scholars Office. So I'm certainly happy to be here today. I also have a PhD in economics, and that really I think will become evident as I'm going through this presentation. And the title of the presentation is Managing Your Money and Finances Strategically. It's very important to the university and to the Office of International Students and Scholars that you get on target to succeed financially, not only in terms of your professional career, but also in terms of your financial life. And so we want to make sure you have information that can be helpful to you, particularly as you transition into being an individual working at UCSF from another country. So let's get started. You know, the reality is that I expect that most people do not have enough money to do absolutely everything they might want to do in any given month. As a result, they have to make choices. They have to prioritize in how they're going to use their somewhat limited resources to meet their somewhat unlimited wants and needs, both in the short and the long term. And I would suspect that if you're attending this webinar, you're probably like that. I know it's certainly true for me. And I would expect that there are certain factors that you consider when making financial decisions to meet your needs and wants. And I would expect there are certain strategic objectives that are going to guide that decision making, and that they include at least the following 5 objectives. That you want to be maximizing control of your money you're spending. You want to be in charge of deciding how you spend the money you have, particularly any extra money you might have. 2, I expect you want to be efficient. You want to be making the best use of every dollar. Given that you likely have limited dollars to meet your somewhat unlimited wants and needs, both over the short and long term, you've got to make priorities, you've got to make choices that hopefully will lead to the best possible outcome for you. 3, I expect you want to be managing and potentially minimizing your exposure to financial risk. Regardless of where you live in the world, we all face financial uncertainty in our lives, uncertainty about our income and uncertainty about our expenses. That's the reality of the world in which we live. But that risk does create anxiety. It puts you in harm's way, and you don't like being in harm's way. So I fully expect that you do things to try to minimize that risk. Things like saving for emergencies, buying insurance, and to the extent you have debt, paying off that debt more aggressively. I also expect that when repaying debt, that you want to be responsible in doing so. You want to make sure you're repaying the debt responsibly so that you're not damaging your credit. And finally, particularly once you are earning income, which you will be, that you want to be planning financially for your future, which includes building financial security and wealth. That includes saving for emergencies, investing for retirement, and saving for other investments, such as the purchase of a new home. And I would expect that these 5 objectives, and perhaps others that are important to you, such as your desire to be philanthropic, are guiding your decisions when planning how you pay your monthly living expenses, how you repay any debt, and how you prepare for your financial future. And when it comes to managing your finances, that becomes a process that really is a month-to-month activity, but actually can be even more day-to-day. But there are certain steps you need to take if you want to be successful at achieving those strategic objectives I've just identified when managing your finances. First of all, you want to develop and follow a manageable budget or spending plan. Your budget or spending plan is how you decide how you're going to spend the resources you have to meet your needs and wants, both in the short and the long term. And if you don't have a plan on how you're going to be spending that money, you're likely spending more than you might need to. You're likely going to be less successful in achieving all your goals. And you certainly will not have as much control over how you're spending your money. So if you want to achieve those objectives, you certainly want to make sure that you're kind of in charge of deciding or planning for how you're going to use your limited resources to meet the somewhat unlimited wants and needs. I also expect that since you're earning income, you want to be planning for your future financially in terms of building financial security and wealth. And as I mentioned, that includes saving for emergencies, which is protecting you from risk, investing for retirement, and also saving for other investments, such as the purchase of a new home, perhaps paying for your children's education, and so forth. You also want to be protecting yourself from financial risk, which, as I said, I expect is why people tend to have savings in part for emergencies, why they tend to buy insurance, and why they tend to pay off debt more quickly. Because when you have debt, you've in essence increased your exposure to financial risk. Because when you have debt, typically, you've created a fixed, inflexible monthly payment obligation, whether it's credit card debt, a car loan, a mortgage for a home, or, for example, a student loan. Debt puts you at risk because it creates this fixed, inflexible expense, and it's not going to adjust or accommodate over time how your financial circumstances might change, particularly if you had some negative change to your circumstances. So again, that becomes a reason why, in part, people may choose to pay off debt more aggressively. 4, you want to build and maintain good credit, because having good credit is important to achieve other goals in life, particularly your desire to make investments like the purchase of a home. But having good credit could also be important, depending upon where you live, to getting the job you want and so forth. So again, building and maintaining good credit is very important to success over the long term. And finally, you do want to repay any debt responsibly, so that you do not get into trouble with your credit, so that you're building a strong credit history. But you also want to be strategic about it. And we'll talk briefly later in the presentation how you can be strategic, keeping in mind those 5 strategic objectives when paying back any form of debt you may have. And the reality is, most adults at some point in their life do have debt, either perhaps because they had to borrow money to pay for their education, perhaps they borrowed money to buy a home, perhaps they borrowed money to buy a car. It doesn't matter what the reason is. Most adults typically have some amount of debt, at least at certain times in their life, particularly during the working years of their life. And you just want to make sure that to the extent you're repaying that debt, you're being responsible in doing so by making sure you're paying at least the minimum amount due, the amount being billed by whoever loaned you the money, by the due date, so that you don't damage your credit. Well, let's begin with the very first step in managing your finances, developing your budget. Because again, strategically, we identified that I expect you want to be in control of deciding how you spend the limited resources you have to meet the somewhat unlimited wants and needs. So you need to create your spending plan. That's really what a budget is all about. And the bottom line is, the reality is you have to decide how you're going to be spending the money you have, which is primarily coming, I expect, from your earnings, your income, and meeting your needs, which really fall into what I call 4 buckets: the past, the present, the future, and philanthropy. And in essence, you have to decide how to allocate your income and resources to meet your needs that fall into these 4 buckets. The past is the amount you're having or choosing to pay each month when repaying debt. The present is the amount you're spending each month on your living expenses. The future is the amount you're saving and investing for future anticipated expenses, like emergencies, retirement, other investments like the purchase of a new home or your children's education. And philanthropy is the amount you're choosing to contribute charitably to organizations, donating to charitable organizations. And in essence, your needs really fall into these 4 buckets. Now, in some cases, for example, your living expenses may involve not only your own living expenses, but the living expenses of others, such as family members. But the point is, when you look at your family unit or the household unit, I would expect your expenses fall into these 4 buckets. So what is involved in planning your budget? What steps should you take when planning your budget? Well, first of all, you want to determine how much money you'll have available each month to spend. 2, you want to identify how you spend the money now, particularly if you're not currently living in the United States but headed this way. Figure out how are you spending money now. But then you also need to figure out how will your current spending change, either increase or decreased, as you move forward in your life and in your career, particularly as you move from wherever you are right now to the Bay Area of Northern California to begin your work at UCSF. And for those of you who are already here, obviously you understand that your current spending levels are likely different from what they were perhaps before you relocated to UCSF. And again, you just want to understand that over time, as your circumstances change, your need for spending, the amount you're spending, will either increase or decrease. For example, when you are finished with your work at UCSF and you move elsewhere, either to another country or somewhere else in the United States, again, that will likely cause a change in what your circumstances are. If there's a change in your family structure, you get married, you get divorced, you have a child, whatever it may be, you're supporting others in your family, parents or other relatives. Again, as your circumstances change, that's going to likely alter the way in which you're spending money. So you want to be mindful of that over time. So your budget is really a dynamic plan. It's not static. You don't create the plan and then put it on a shelf or in a drawer. It's a plan that you're going to adjust over time. And that's why it's so important once you've created your budget to be tracking your spending. First of all, to make sure you're sticking to that plan. And one of the questions that was provided to me in advance was the concern that an individual may have trouble sticking to their budget. So what can you do to help stick to your budget? Well, it involves tracking how you're spending money. We'll talk more about that. And then to make adjustments over time as you need to accommodate changes. And perhaps because initially that first try at the budget plan or spending plan may not be quite accurate. You may have over or underestimated either spending or resources. So again, you want to view your budget as a living sort of live plan that you need to be willing to adjust and accommodate changes over time. And when it comes to building your budget, when building your budget, you always want to pay yourself first. In other words, you want to make sure you're thinking about that future bucket. You always want to make sure that to the extent you want to be investing and saving for the future, which all people should do if they don't want to have to work till they die, then you want to make sure that before you spend money anywhere else, you pay yourself. And typically you can have that money coming right out of your paycheck. So you don't even have to make a decision about how much to allocate. You simply let the payroll office at UCSF know how much you want to be going into savings or investing for retirement and so forth. And within the United States, the general rule of thumb is that you want to strive to be investing and saving at least 10% of your gross monthly income starting in your early 20s if you hope to be able to retire and continue to maintain the same lifestyle in retirement when you retire in your late 60s. Now, the point is, some of you may say, well, I'm beyond my early 20s, and yet I haven't been doing anything yet. Well, that's okay. It means you've probably fallen a bit behind, but it does mean you need to think about trying to make sure you're not falling farther behind and perhaps trying to catch up. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but the point is, if you want to be successful, the general rule of thumb in terms of building financial security and wealth is to pay yourself before you pay anything else. The opposite of that would be to be saving and investing anything that's left over. Well, chances are there will be less left over than you could have planned for if you'd paid yourself first. It always can be useful to use tools when building your budget, whether you create your own spreadsheet or worksheet or you use online tools. That just helps to make sure you're not overlooking any specific categories that you'd want to consider with regard to your spending plan. And it also may help you to do the math. You want to be conservative. You want to underestimate how much money you'll have to spend each month, particularly if you're not here yet. And you want to overestimate what you think your expenses are going to be, again, particularly if you haven't yet arrived on campus and then are not really sure exactly what financial life will look like once you get here. You want to watch out for cash leaks. And this is where, here in the United States, you can withdraw money from an ATM machine, as I'm sure you can pretty much anywhere in the world. The problem is when you're taking money out of an ATM, have you really planned for that? Or did you just happen to walk by an ATM and thought, oh, well, I want to get some extra cash? Now, in that case, did you plan for that withdrawal? Or is that going to bust your budget? Is that going to cause you to spend more than you planned on? So again, you want to be very careful when you're using an ATM to pull out money that you thought about it, that you planned for that that you didn't, it's just not an impulsive kind of, passing by kind of activity, because that could bust your budget. And finally, particularly if you're still in any phase of training, you want to live below your means. You want to be aware of luxuries that are dressed as necessity, and you want to be thrifty, and you want to be frugal. So, what are the factors that are going to determine your net paycheck? In the United States, you start with your gross annual salary. Then you have to divide that by the number of paychecks you're going to get in a calendar year. In other words, how many pay periods are there in a calendar year? And Holly, what is the number of pay periods typically for an employee at UCSF?
Oh,
Are they
God,
paid every 2 weeks?
monthly.
They're paid monthly.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you're going to get one paycheck a month. And that's important because, as an example, with many employers in the United States, you get paid every 2 weeks. And what that means then is that you get two paychecks 10 months of the year. You get three paychecks 2 months of the year. So if you're getting paid every 2 weeks, if you take your annual salary and divide it by 12, that's going to actually overestimate how much income you might be getting in 10 months of the year and underestimate how much income you're getting the other 2 months. And although at UCSF it sounds like you're going to get paid once a month, so it's reasonable to divide the annual salary by 12 to know how much you're going to getting paid before taxes on a monthly basis. You may move on to some other employer down the road. And you want to be mindful that if you're getting paid every 2 weeks, which is a very common method of payment, that you're not getting the same amount every month. Then there's going to be mandatory payroll deductions. Working in the United States means you've got to pay taxes to the federal government, to the state of California. I don't know that there's any jurisdictions in the Bay Area that also charge taxes, but the university will make sure that the amounts that have to be deducted from your paycheck are done so. Those are the mandatory payroll deductions. It'll reduce the amount you actually see in your paycheck. But you also may choose to voluntarily have certain deductions. For example, contributions to a tax-deferred retirement plan, perhaps additional contributions to some sort of a health insurance type plan, and so forth. So again, the amount you actually have to work with every pay period is not equal to your gross monthly salary. It's equal to that gross monthly salary minus the mandatory and voluntary payroll deductions. So I provided to you here in a slide, and there's also a handout that gives you a sense of a kind of a budgeting worksheet template that you might use. So first of all, you start out with your income. What is your gross monthly pay? And you simply take the gross annual salary you're going to be getting paid and divide it by 12 in the case of UCSF. Then you subtract from that the deductions. Now, if you're not sure what the deductions are going to be, you could assume about 30% of the gross monthly amount. But you also could contact the International Students and Scholars Office. If they can't give you a little bit better help, you certainly could contact, hopefully, the Human Resources Department, and they might give you a sense of, what kind of percentage should you consider. But in general, in most cases, 30% is probably not too far off the mark, all right? At least in terms of the required mandatory payroll deductions. So that leaves you then with your net monthly pay. Then you start subtracting the expenses, starting with paying yourself first. Remember that future bucket, savings and investing. So how much do you want to be saving? How much do you want to be putting towards retirement type contributions and investments? What about your emergency fund? What about the cash you might need for the down payment to buy a home? Again, you want to make sure that you're thinking about that future bucket. And ideally, you want to try to be contributing at least 10% of your gross, not your net, monthly paycheck towards saving and investing. We're going to talk a little bit more about saving and investing and the difference between savings and investing a little bit later on in the webinar. Once you've determined that, you subtract the amount you're going to have paying yourself first in the future bucket, and that leaves you then with a balance. Now, with that balance, you go to the next bucket, the past bucket, because every month you've got to, at minimum, be paying what any lender is requiring you to pay to repay any debt you have. Debt that could be coming from use of your credit cards, from a car loan, from student loans, if you have student loans, from a mortgage, any other debt you may have. And what you want to factor in here is what, at a minimum, do you have to be paying every month? What is that lender requiring you to pay each month? so that you don't damage your credit. Then you subtract that from the balance left over after you put money into the future bucket, and that leaves you now with a balance that I label as E. And now we get to the present bucket, your living expenses. This is going to include your housing expenses, rent or mortgage, utilities, phone, internet, cable, insurance, which includes health insurance, auto insurance if you have a car, because in the United States, if you have a car, you have to have it insured to be legally driving it on public roads. If you have a home, you typically have homeowners insurance. If you're renting, you may have renters insurance, not so much to protect the apartment, but to protect your furnishings inside the apartment should there be any damage, such as from fire or water damage. And then in the United States, there's also long-term care insurance. Insurance is designed to help you cover the cost of long-term care if you at later stages in your life have to be getting acute care for acute conditions like living in a nursing home and so forth to help with the cost of that. You also have to meet your nutritional needs. So you have expenses related to food, groceries, perhaps eating out. You have transportation expenses. Perhaps you have a car, and therefore you're going to have gas, maintenance, parking, and insurance for the car. Perhaps you're going to use public transit. Well, it's not free. You got to pay for it. Perhaps you'll use ride-sharing services like Uber or Lyft. And again, what are you going to be spending on transportation to get, in and around the campus and elsewhere? What about clothing? Not just new purchases, but also maintaining the clothing you already have. And certainly, if you're relocating to the Bay Area, once you get here, you may discover that your wardrobe doesn't quite work. Perhaps it doesn't really accommodate the climate of Northern California, particularly the Bay Area. Perhaps the wardrobe is not quite adequate for, how you should be dressing in the work that you're doing. So again, be mindful that that's another expense, perhaps more discretionary. But again, be mindful of that, particularly as you consider relocating to the Bay Area. Entertainment. You have to have a balance, a work-life balance. Working all the time is going to lead to burnout. So you have to think about entertainment. And certainly San Francisco and the Bay Area provides lots of opportunities for dining out, movies, concerts, sporting events, theater events, musical events, and so forth. Most of which cost money, although there are also things you can do for free. Things like going to Golden Gate Park and just walking around enjoying nature, going to the ocean and sitting on the beach. These are things you can do for free once you get there. So again, but you need to be mindful that you have to have some work-life balance. And that's in part what entertainment is designed to accommodate and provide. And then you will have likely other miscellaneous personal expenses, personal grooming, personal hygiene, if you have a pet care expenses, and so forth. So the point is, you add up all those expenses, and that comes out to be the total you're spending on living expenses for the month. Subtract that from the prior balance, and that leaves you with the final bucket, the philanthropy bucket. To what extent do you want to be making charitable donations to organizations? And then by the time you then subtract that from from the prior tally, the final balance should be zero. In other words, you should have allocated all of the income you had to spend across the four buckets. Now, what if the balance is greater than zero? Then you have to decide, where are you going to spend that extra money? Are you going to put it in the future bucket to be investing and saving a larger percentage of the income? Are you going to use it in the past bucket to more quickly paying back any debt that you have? You're going to use it on the present bucket to have a little bit nicer lifestyle, or you're going to put it in the philanthropy bucket to be more charitable, or a combination of both. The point is, you need to make sure the money is allocated somewhere so that it's not just sitting in a drawer. All right? But what if the balance is less than zero? What if it's negative? Then you've spent too much. You've spent more than you had to spend. So now you need to go back and figure out, where can you make adjustments? And you'll probably, unfortunately, start with the future bucket. You'll probably cut back from there. And that's going to harm you in the long run, but it may be the reality. You can't cut back from the minimum amount you're paying on your debts, so you can't do anything there. The only other places you could perhaps make adjustments are to cut back in your living expenses or cut back in your charitable contributions. The point is, your budget needs to be balanced. In other words, you have to make sure you've allocated across the four buckets all of the income you have to spend in that month, but no more than that. Now, Here is the actual budget planning worksheet that I provided as a handout, just as a template to give you a sense of what the worksheet might look like. There are a number of online tools that you could use. You could create your own spreadsheet using Excel or some other spreadsheet program on your computer. The point is, you're going to be more effective if you write it down. You need to write it down and write it down in a way that makes it easy to monitor and follow. And this lays it out in exactly the ways I've just did. Start with the income, then the future bucket, then the past bucket, then the present bucket, and finally the philanthropy bucket, recognizing that the bottom line, the balance, should be zero. All right. So, spending, particularly on your living expenses, is all about choices. So, what are ways, in some ways, you might reduce your spending once you're on campus and working at UCSF? Well, housing is very expensive in the Bay Area. It may be a lot more expensive than where you're living right now. It may not be that much different. It depends upon where you live right now. But those of you who are already here, you have already discovered how expensive housing can be in the Bay Area, particularly if you're living in areas that are convenient to the campuses, either the Parnassus campus or the Mission Bay campus. Housing is pretty expensive. Now, the reality is it's going to be more affordable if you're sharing the cost of housing with at least one roommate. And I don't mean sharing a bedroom. A two-bedroom apartment is not twice as expensive in the Bay Area as a one-bedroom or studio apartment. So again, if you can have a roommate, that can help reduce your housing costs. Now, I realize if you're single and you're moving to the Bay Area on your own, you probably don't know anyone to have as a roommate. But that's where you want to reach out to the International Students and Scholars Office. Reach out to the postdoc office to find out, do they have a resource to help you identify potential roommates? And I realize, when you first get here, you may not feel comfortable having a roommate. But then once you're here and you start meeting people, particularly people you're working with, explore the possibility of trying to find a roommate, particularly if you're going to be here for more than 1 year. Because again, having a roommate can lower the cost of housing. Another possibility is renting a room rather than an apartment. There are people who may be willing to rent out a room in their home where you probably would have access to the kitchen and other common areas in the house, where that could be less expensive than renting an apartment. Again, explore these options. And again, I would certainly check with the ISSO office and with the postdoc office about possible resources they could share with you to help you in that process, particularly as you're looking to relocate to the Bay Area. Certainly, bringing your lunch to campus every day, bringing your own beverages and snacks is going to be cheaper than buying the food on campus. Buying food on campus is always going to be more expensive. Now, you may decide that it's a lot more convenient, and convenience can be important to you, but realize convenience typically comes at a cost. So be mindful of that. To the extent you do go out and eat out and go out for entertainment, go out for an evening of entertainment, try to do so at places that are affordable when you have that night out. Don't go to the most expensive places unless, somebody else is paying for it. Dress for less. To the extent you need to be buying new clothes, consider shopping at discount stores. You can consider joining a warehouse club. In the United States, we have several different companies that are warehouse clubs. The most common, the most well-known is probably Costco. In fact, you may already be a member of Costco where you live now because they have stores throughout the world. And the reality is, these large warehouse clubs, although you're buying in bulk, they just lower the cost of things. Now, you may not want to be buying a 20-pound bag of potatoes yourself because they might spoil before you've got through them. But again, if you could share them with 2 or 3 other people, that makes sense. Also, there's lots of things you can buy that aren't going to spoil. Your paper goods, your toiletries, your detergent, things like that. If it's not a perishable item, then does it really matter if you buy it in a larger quantity because it's going to be cheaper? You want to shop with a list and only buy what's on that list. One of the ways in which you can control your spending, and this was one of the questions I was asked, is that whenever you go out shopping, write down what you plan to buy. Think in advance of what you need to buy. Then buy only what's on that list. And if as you're shopping around, you see things that aren't on the list and you think, oh, I think I'm going to buy that, that could be an impulse. If you didn't think you needed that when you created your list, then you may not really need it. So you may want to wait. Give it, a couple of hours, or at least, give it maybe a day before you go back and buy that item. Really think about whether or not you needed that item if it wasn't on that original list. It certainly is a good idea to use coupons, but only use a coupon if you need something. Don't buy something just because you have a coupon. If it's on your list and you can buy it with a coupon, then that's great. But if it's not on your list, don't buy it just because you have a coupon. Again, that's a bit of an impulse and it's perhaps overspending. And beware of impulse shopping and buying for convenience. Whenever you order takeout food or have food delivered, you're ordering that's convenience. And yeah, that can be beneficial to you. That may be worth it to you, but it's costing you more than if you went and picked it up yourself or you made it yourself. All right. Also be aware that whenever you go shopping, if you're buying things that aren't on a list, then that's very well an impulse. That if you didn't think in advance that you needed that item, and now you see it, maybe because it's on sale, maybe it's reduced. But if it wasn't on your list, do you really need it, or is that an impulse? Distinguish between what you need and what you want. In my experience, and I'm 71 years old, and I certainly know that I've seen lots of things that I thought I needed when in fact I just wanted them. Now, when you're working full time and earning income, it makes it perhaps easier to afford the things you want in addition to the things you need. But particularly if you're still in a training phase of your career and you're not really yet earning exactly what you expect to be earning once you have reached the point where you're in your full profession, in your full career path, then be very careful about that because anytime you're spending money on things you want, that's money that's not being made available, not being saved, not being invested for future anticipated expenses. And remember, the future has risk. There's no certainty about the future. You certainly want to try to have fun to balance your work life. And to the extent you can have free fun, that becomes a good idea. And there's lots of things you can do in the San Francisco and Bay Area for free that are legal. And if you're not currently in the Bay Area, when you get here, ask the locals, ask your colleagues who you're working with, ask the people in the International Student and Scholars Office about where can you get bargains, where are the free things. Certainly not far from the Parnassus campus is Golden Gate Park. It's a beautiful park. And not far from either campus is either the bay or the ocean. Again, and if you love the water like I do, again, that becomes a great opportunity. Going to see the Golden Gate Bridge. It doesn't cost you anything to go see the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, if you want to drive across it, yes, that may cost you something. But you can walk across. It's a nice walk. You can stand on either side of the bridge and see it. It's beautiful. So again, there's lots of things you can do that can provide work-life balance that don't have to cost you any money, or at least not cost you very much. So be mindful of that. And again, if you're not sure whether good deals are, ask the people who've already been here for a while, because they certainly will have some good ideas and suggestions. There's also some other resources that may be available to you to help make ends meet. There are community resources available. There's the emergency food supply through the San Francisco Food Bank, and I've given you the current URL for their website. There's the CalFresh program. Now, this may be eligible for financial assistance to help you pay for basic food items. This, in essence, is California's food stamp program. Now, again, you may not qualify, but again, it's something to certainly explore, and I've given you the website for that. UCSF provides certain resources for employees. There's housing, food, and transportation support services, including the guaranteed ride home. If you're working late at night on campus, on either the Parnassus or Mission Bay campus, and you're needing to get home, but you didn't drive, you're typically using public transit, you may not feel comfortable using public transit in all cases. So this is where that resource may become available. So again, just realize that there are resources available to help you make ends meet if you're having any challenges. And again, if you're not sure what to do, but you know you need some help, then certainly get in touch with either the International Student and Scholars Office or the postdoc office, because if they can't help you, they certainly may be able to refer you to other resources, other offices at the university that can provide some support and help. Now, a couple things I also want to add before we move on. Let me see what the next slide is. I think the next slide, we're going to the next topic. So I want to stop here for a minute. One of the questions that I was asked to address is the following. How can I make sure that I stick to my budget? I have a very difficult time sticking to a budget that I've set for myself. Do I have any tips? Well, let me give you a very old-fashioned tip. And I've already told you, I'm 71 years old. Now, the sort of probably the best example I can give you of if you want to really be in control of your money, then first and foremost, you only use cash. You don't use electronic means or plastic means to be paying for things. And I realize in our world today, many people rely solely on electronic or, plastic-based sources of financial transactions. Their credit cards, their debit cards, perhaps they're using their phone and using electronic payment means. The problem is when you're using an electronic means or you're using a credit card or even a debit card, it doesn't really allow you to immediately appreciate the impact of spending that money. It doesn't allow you to immediately understand how much money will be left. Because even though if you may have a sense of how much is in your checking account or your savings account, when you use an electronic transaction or you use a credit card or a debit card, do you subtract that from the amount of money that's sitting in your checking account? Most people don't do that. But if you use cash, then you immediately know how much money is left. And the old-fashioned way is to use what is called the envelope method. At the beginning of each month or the beginning of each week, whichever you prefer, you sit down and you create an envelope for each category of expense: housing, food, entertainment, transportation, clothing, and whatever other categories. Then, based on your budget or spending plan, you put the amount of cash in each of those envelopes that you've allocated and plan to spend on that category that month. Then you only spend money out of those envelopes. You don't use any plastic, you don't use any electronic transactions. And when the envelope is empty, then you're out of money for that category. So in essence, you stop spending money on that category that month, or you take from some other envelope, but then that's going to take money away from that. So if you want to have the greatest possible control of how you're spending your money, if you want to try to make sure you're not spending more than you planned on, then you want to try to make sure that you're using cash as much as possible. Now, I understand, you may be very anxious about walking around with lots of cash. I'm not talking about that. Each day when you go to work or you go out to have some fun, decide, in terms of those categories, how much do you think you want to spend that day? Knowing that you might not be quite right, knowing that you probably will still have a debit card or a credit card in your wallet in case there's an emergency. But the point is, let's say you think you're going to spend maybe no more than $50 that day. It's a work day, you maybe not even spend that much. Then make sure you don't have more than $50 in your wallet or your purse. All right. And then try to use that as the means to be paying for the things you're paying for. Now, yes, you want to still make sure you have a credit card or a debit card so that if an emergency comes along, you would have a means to sort of deal with that emergency. But if you want to be in control to the greatest extent possible of sticking to that budget you've created, then that's very important. Try to figure out a way that will allow you to be in control. And when you're using cash, you immediately see how much money is left after you've spent money on anything. Now, another important step will be to make sure you're tracking your progress. In other words, to track your spending. What I do now is every day, whenever I spend money on anything, I try to make sure I get a receipt. And at the end of the day, I have an Excel spreadsheet where I go in and I enter in the amounts on every receipt. I put the day, the amount, and what kind of item it was, because I want that information. And then every month I look to see, okay, did I spend more than I planned? And if so, why? What happened that month that caused me to spend more? Did I have some sort of emergency? Did my car break down or something? Or did I just choose to spend more? I wanted to do something for more fun. And what does that mean about the next month? Then how am I going to accommodate that? Where can I cut back the next month? Now, what if, on the other hand, at the end of the month, I realized I didn't spend all that I had planned? Again, why was that the case? Did something happen? Or did I just overestimate? And so I can adjust my budget plan. So again, view your budget as a living, breathing plan. Don't view it as something that you set up and then never look back at it again. Again, if you want to make it work, that's what you need to do. So these are the suggestions I can provide to help you be in more control in terms of sticking to that budget. All right. Now, you also want to make sure, though, as I said, that you're not overlooking that future bucket. I expect that most people don't want to work until they die. Therefore, it means they've got to be planning for their future. They don't want to leave their future financial security to chance. You also want to be making sure you have money for emergencies. You want to make sure you're saving for future investments, like the purchase of a home, your children's education, and so forth. And you want to get in the habit of putting money in that future bucket, of, in essence, paying yourself first. It's a bucket you cannot afford to ignore. And I'll show you why in just a few minutes. But there's an important difference between investing and saving. When you're investing, you're typically trying to get compounding growth, but you're trying to get maximum compounding growth. So in the United States, most people, when investing for long-term growth for retirement, they're investing in the stock market through either individual stocks, but more likely pools of stocks, mutual funds, index funds, exchange trade funds. And, financial planners would suggest that if you want to be able to afford to retire in your mid to late 60s and maintain the same lifestyle in retirement that you had when you were working, you want to strive to be investing a minimum of 10% of your gross monthly income starting in your early 20s if you be able to hope to do that, because it'll take probably at least 40 to 45 years for that money you're investing to really grow to an amount such that when you're in retirement and no longer getting a paycheck, you'll have enough assets to live on to cover your expenses and maintain the same lifestyle. But I understand, particularly when you first start working here at UCSF, given the high cost of living in the Bay Area, you may not be able to afford to contribute 10% of your gross monthly income. But even a small amount can be a good start because you're wanting to get in the habit of investing for the future. And then as your income grows, perhaps add more as you get a raise. Instead of using all of that raise to spend more on your lifestyle, put some of that towards the future as well. But when you're investing for retirement, at least in the United States, then you're trying to do so in a way that also is getting you some tax benefits. Because I was asked the question, why are you taxed on retirement funds? Well, I can't necessarily answer that question other than say that's what our government and our Congress over the years has decided was appropriate. Now, they have also created ways for you to invest money to get some tax benefits. For example, the university has a 403b plan, which you may be allowed to participate in. And you'll learn more about that, particularly once you arrive and go through any orientation program. But as an employee, you may be allowed to participate in the university's 403b plan. You may not. It's going to depend upon your status as an employee. But the point is, that's a plan whereby the money you're investing is tax deferred. You're investing income that you've earned, but that income has not yet been taxed. It will be taxed once you start pulling the money out in retirement. All right. So it means you're getting a little bit larger paycheck, but you're going to have the taxes paid on the back end. There's also an approach where you can be investing income that's already been taxed. That's what's called a Roth IRA or a Roth option to a 403b or tax deferred plan. There, the money you're investing has already been taxed. So you have a little bit less in your paycheck, but all the earnings on the investment will be tax free. And that is considered a more favorable tax approach. So again, if you are eligible to participate in the university's retirement plan, then I expect you'll get information as part of your orientation from the Benefits Department and Human Resources about that. If you're not eligible to participate, doesn't mean you still can't be setting up your own retirement account. A traditional IRA is where you as an individual are setting up a tax-deferred retirement plan. A Roth IRA is, again, an individual retirement account that you're setting up yourself, but where it's getting the benefits of the Roth approach. In either case, I'd certainly encourage you to consider that. But also realize that under the current laws of the United States, money you're putting in a retirement account typically is not readily available to you. It's kind of locked up. It's not liquid until you reach at least age 59 and a half. Now, I understand that you may be thinking, well, wait a minute. If I'm investing in the stock market in the United States, but I don't plan to stay in the United States, what does that mean? Well, you should always be able to move that money somewhere else, I would expect, at some point in time. So again, that doesn't necessarily restrict you in your options. But again, for more details about that, I'd certainly start with the Benefits Department at UCSF. And again, I realize that not all of you may be eligible to participate in the university's retirement plan, but that doesn't mean you can't set up your own. And you could set it up in your own country. You don't necessarily have to set it up in the stock market in the United States. If you want to get tax benefits through the United States, you would have to do that. But again, you may be able to set up through your own country and transfer the funds to that wherever it is in the country in which you plan to live. But you also want to have savings. Savings are money that are readily available. They're not restricted in their use. They're not at risk. With the stock market, you risk losing the money. It has ups and downs, but it has the greatest potential for compounding growth. But there's risk. With savings, you're wanting to make sure you're not going to risk losing the money. The growth potential is not nearly as great. The interest rates, the rates of return are not nearly as high, but you want to have savings for emergencies. And in general, if you want to minimize your exposure to financial risk, which you identified as one of those strategic objectives, then you probably want to have at least 3 to 6 months of your average monthly living expenses set aside in a savings account for emergencies. And I certainly encourage you to open up a high yield savings account, which you can do as long as you have a Social Security number, which you will have. You should be able to open a high yield savings account within a financial institution in the United States or in your home country. And they tend to pay higher rates of interest than just traditional savings accounts. You just want to make sure there's no restrictions on your ability to withdraw the funds, that there's no minimum deposit requirements, there's no minimum daily balance requirements, and there's no fees charged with having that high yield savings account. You want to be saving for the possible purchase of a home, because at least in the United States, if you hope to buy a home here, you're going to have cash to do the deal for the down payment and the closing costs. And if you plan to have a family, or already have a family, to what extent are you going to want to be and need to be paying for their education? And what do you want to be doing now to be preparing for that expense? So again, the future bucket is a bucket you can't afford to ignore. And again, I mentioned that there's a difference between investments and savings. There's a difference in growth potential, a difference in potential tax benefits, a difference in risk, and a difference in liquidity. With investments, typically here we're talking, at least primarily at this point, about your retirement account. You expect compounding growth, and you hope the rate of return exceeds inflation, and it certainly should. And it tends to be, contributions may have tax benefits, tax deferred or tax favored in the case of the Roth option. Typically, you're investing in the stock market where there's risk, but that's where you have the maximum potential for compounding growth over time. And the funds may not be liquid, particularly if you're getting any tax benefits until you reach retirement age, which currently would be at least age 59 and a half. So be mindful of that. The benefit of investing in the stock market is you're maximizing the potential for growth, but you're also taking on risk. You also may get some tax benefits, but the funds may not be liquid. But you also want to make sure you have funds readily available when you need them. Here you expect more limited compounding growth. The rate of return is going to be less than inflation typically. Typically, there are no tax benefits, but there's no risk, and the funds are readily available or liquid. So again, this really distinguishes the difference between investments and savings. You probably want to be focusing on a combination of both, but this is all about the future bucket. And timing matters when you're earning compounding interest. It doesn't pay to wait. Faster is always better. And this illustrates that point. And this is a slide that was created by a financial advisor whose career is focused on helping people build wealth and to save over the long term, particularly for retirement. So let's look at the example of Randy and Rachel. At age 25, Randy realized he had $200 a month he wanted to be investing. So he started investing that money every month, and he continued doing so till he retired at age 65. So over that 40 years, investing $200 a month, over that 40 years or 480 months, he invested a total of $96,000. Now he's getting an average annual rate of return of 8%. Now, some years he was earning less than that. Some years he may have lost money. But if we look at the long-term average annual rates of return in the stock market in the United States, going back to 1926, basically 99 years ago, which includes the entire period of time of the Depression in the early part of the 20th century, the entire period of time of World War II, the entire period of time during the Vietnam conflict, during the recession in the 80s and in early 2000s, you still could expect reasonably an average annual rate of return of 8% if you're willing to take a moderate level of risk in your investment strategy and are getting started at a relatively young age. So investment of $96,000 grew to $698,201. In other words, he earned a little over $600,000 by investing that money every month over the 40 years. Now, Rachel waited for 10 years. She didn't start investing $200 a month until age 35. And she continued doing so until age 65. So she invested a total of $72,000, $24,000 less than Randy. She was getting the same average annual rate of return. So her investment of $72,000 grew to $298,071. $400,000 less than Randy. But the difference in terms of what they invested was only $24,000. So by waiting for 10 years, Rachel lost the opportunity to have earned an additional $400,000. So it was going to take a lot more money for Rachel to catch up. So this is why I said, even if you can only be investing a small amount, say $25, $50, or maybe $200, don't wait. Try to get on that compounding growth curve as soon as you can. Start getting into that future bucket as soon as you can, even if it's a small amount. It's the habit, and it's getting on that compounding growth curve that's important. But it's also important to realize that slow and steady is the best way to approach it. If you're trying to time your investments with the stock market, you're not going to do nearly as well as if you're investing something every month. People who invested something every month have always done much better than those who tried to invest based on the best possible days, and which is what this slide is indicating. So get in the habit as soon as you can, and remember, slow and steady is the best way to maximize growth potential over the long term. And remember, save as much as you can, get in the habit of saving and investing. Start now. As we've seen, timing matters when compounding interest is in the picture, which it is. Try to invest a minimum of 10% of your gross monthly income, but even a small amount initially is important. And assume, particularly if you plan to stay in the United States, that you'll need at least 70% of your annual pre-retirement income to live comfortably in retirement. And evaluate how spending, where you can see where you can cut your costs. If you want to try to figure out how to maximize your saving and investing, then you need to figure out where can you cut back on spending in the other buckets, particularly the present bucket. And you need to set realistic goals. You need to ask hard questions. At what age do you hope to retire? What lifestyle do you hope to maintain in retirement? Where do you hope to retire to? Where do you hope to live? And what is it going to cost to live there? But also write the goals down. Don't just keep them in your head. Write them down and review that listing. Review that list and update it periodically, particularly when there are changes in your circumstances. A marriage, a breakup of marriage, a birth of a child, and so forth. So that's how you can really start planning for your financial future. Now, what about building and maintaining good credit? We had quite a few questions about that. So let's talk about this. Why is having good credit important? Well, because you need good credit to qualify for credit loans. You may need good credit to get the job you want. Most employers in the United States, as part of their review and pre-qualification requirements, are going to pull your credit report, not because they see if you have debt. They want to see if you're responsible. Are you responsible about how you're managing any debt that you have? In the United States, you typically have to have good credit to obtain affordable insurance. And having good credit will be important to your achievement of other financial goals, particularly if borrowing money is a part of your future. Borrowing money to buy a home, borrowing money to finance a professional practice, and so forth. So what if you don't know if you have good credit? Well, you start by checking to see if you have a credit history in the United States. And you can do that most easily by going to annualcreditreport.com. If you have a credit history in the United States, that will be evident when you go to annualcreditreport.com. It'll allow you to see your credit report with each of the three national credit reporting agencies, TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. You can also, at that point, check your credit score. Now, what is a credit score? A credit score is a numerical forecast of the likelihood you'll successfully repay a future loan on time. It's based on a credit account information in your credit report, and it's an automated credit evaluation tool. It's how lenders decide whether or not they're going to loan you money. Credit scores were first developed by a company called Fair Isaac and Company. That's why the most commonly used credit scores are called FICO scores, because Fair Isaac is abbreviated by FICO, F-I-C-O. The scoring methodology basically looks at a statistically modeling behavior of credit behavior. And it looks at 2 points in time to see, with millions of credit reports, what are the variables in those credit reports that most likely predicted that someone would miss a payment and not pay on time. And as I said, the Fair Isaac's generic score is called the FICO score, but there are many different FICO scoring methods and models, but the score generally ranges from 300 to 850, and you always want a higher score. Higher is always better. And the score looks at primarily 5 factors on your credit report. Your payment history, do you pay things on time? That accounts for the largest contribution of the score, about 35%. The amounts owed is the next most important part. But here they're really focusing primarily on the amount you owe on credit cards and the rate to which you're utilizing your available credit on credit cards. And you always want to try to be minimizing your utilization of your credit cards. It's fine to use them to be building your credit history. And we're going to be talking more in a few minutes about how to build a credit history. But the point is, to the extent you're using a credit card, you want to make sure you're paying the full amount owed each month, not just the minimum amount due. So you're minimizing your utilization of those credit accounts. The length of your credit history has also counts, but it's a much smaller factor. And so because the longer you've had credit, the more reliable the data is. New credit. How often are you applying for new credit? Because the more often you're applying for new credit, the greater the potential risk, because it means you're utilizing credit quite a bit. And do you have different types of credit? Do you have credit cards? Do you have installment loans like a car loan or a student loan? And maximizing your credit score requires that you don't procrastinate, that you pay all your bills on time, and particularly you pay at least the minimum amount due. But you also want to keep your credit card debt as low as possible. To the extent you're using your credit cards, use them for convenience, not for credit. And by that I mean, when you get the bill each month, pay the full amount owed, not just the minimum amount due. Because if you pay just the minimum amount due, then you're using that credit card for credit. You're building up credit card debt, and that's going to start to lower your credit score. And it's also going to dig you into a hole and increase your exposure to risk. However, if you pay the full amount owed, then you're not really using the credit card for credit. At the end of each month, the balance is paid in full. So you're starting fresh. So you're really using it more for convenience. You also want to maximize the length of your credit history. So if you already have credit accounts that have determined your credit history, you probably want to make sure you don't close the oldest of those accounts, even if you're not currently using it. And you do want to minimize opening of new accounts, particularly new credit cards, but you do want to at least have one credit card, because building and maintaining good credit does require that you're paying all your bills on time, but that you're also using credit, and that you notify creditors of changes in address, changes in email address, changes in phone number. You want to limit your use of credit cards for credit. It's fine to use them, but again, try to make sure you're paying the full amount owed every month. You want to minimize your debt overall, particularly from credit cards. You want to review your credit reports annually to make sure the information is correct, that there hasn't been fraudulent information put to your credit report or incorrect information. And once you have credit and once you have a credit report, you want to consider putting a credit freeze on your credit file, which each of the three national criminal reporting agencies. Because in the world we live in today, credit theft and identity theft are a reality of the world. And in order for anyone to open up a credit line, to get a loan or anything, typically that lender is going to ask your permission to pull your credit report. So if you put a credit freeze on your credit report with each of the national three credit bureaus, they're not going to be able to get that credit report until you provide permission to that credit bureau to provide that credit report as well. So that's giving you an added layer of protection. So once you have a credit history, and you can see that you have a credit report with any of the three credit bureaus, I'd encourage you to set up a credit freeze. It's free, and at any point in time, you can remove that freeze temporarily if you're applying for a loan or a credit account. All right? Now, for more information about credit reports and credit scores, you can go to the Federal Trade Commission at consumer.ftc.gov. For more information about credit scoring, the best source is Fair Isaac at myfico.com. The three national credit bureaus in the United States are Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. And for more information in general about credit, you can go to Credit Karma or Credit Sesame. But one of the questions I was asked, and I understand it's a very important issue, is how can you establish a credit history in the United States? The easiest and fastest way to establish a credit history is to have a credit card and to be using that credit card. Now, what if you don't have a credit card? Well, there are ways you can get one. First of all, as long as you have a Social Security number, even if you do not have a credit history and a credit score at this point, there are credit card companies in the United States that very likely would be willing to open a credit card account for you, even though you're an international individual. You're not a citizen or a permanent resident of the United States. And they should be willing to do that. So I'd certainly first start by that. And you can go online and search for international scholar or international student credit cards and see what comes up. Now, what if no credit card company is willing to open up credit card account for you just on the basis of you applying? There are what are called um, insured credit cards. And this is where you apply for a credit card, but if you open up the credit card account, you have to provide a certain amount of money, say $200 or $300, that you give to that credit card company that they hold in what's called an escrow account. In other words, they hold that money. It's your money, but they're holding it so that if for whatever reason, when you use the credit card, you don't pay the minimum amount due on the due date, they're going to take the money to cover that minimum payment from that escrow account. And now that's going to reduce your ability to use the credit card moving forward. Because with these insured credit cards, typically the amount you could charge in total, the limit that you could charge at any given point in time, and O will be equal to whatever that amount is in the escrow account. So that in essence, the lender is protected. And at a certain point in time, they will typically allow you to take that money out of the escrow account. They'll convert it into a regular credit card. But before you apply for insured credit card, which the limits are much lower and typically the interest rates may be higher, start by just trying. See if on your own, as long as you have a Social Security number, which you will if you're employed at UCSF, see if you can apply for a credit card in the United States without having to use an insured account. And this is again assuming you don't already have a credit card. Now, you may have a credit card with a financial institution in another country. That's not really helping you to build up credit in this country. It really needs to be a credit card through a financial institution in the United States. And typically, once you start using that credit card, as long as you're paying the amount due every month, the total amount due, you will very quickly build your credit. And within several months, you should see that your credit score is probably in the high 600s or in the low 700s. And that's where you want to get it to as soon as you can. It's not going to take years to build a good credit history. It can take months. And again, the fastest way to do so is by using a credit card. And start with just one. Then after you've got one and you've had it for a while, you may try opening a second one because it does help to have more than one credit card in terms of building your credit score. But again, I think you can build your credit score fairly quickly. And once your credit score is above 700, then if you needed to borrow money for some other purpose, for example, to borrow a loan to buy a car, as long as you have income and your credit score is above 700 and you have a Social Security number, you'll likely be able to get that car, even if you're not a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. So again, I hope that kind of helps answer some of those questions. Now, remember though, to the extent you're using your credit cards, you want to use them for convenience, not for credit. And you're using them for convenience when you pay the full amount owed each month, not just the minimum amount due. And if for some reason you can't afford to pay the full amount owed, then you probably want to try to stop using that credit card until you do, so that you dig yourself out of that hole. Now, I did mention that you want to be responsible in repaying debt because otherwise you're going to damage your credit. You're going to lower your credit score. But you also want to be strategic. And in essence, whenever you have debt, it doesn't matter what kind of debt it is. It could be credit card debt, could be a car loan, could be a mortgage, could be a student loan. The basic issue is every month you have to decide how much in total are you going to pay on that debt that month, where that total is always equal to the sum of two amounts. And now if you're looking at the video, you'll see I'm holding up my hands. In essence, whenever you're repaying debt, you have to decide how much in total are you going to pay on that debt that month, where that total is always going to be equal to the sum of two amounts, A plus B. A is going to be the amount billed, the amount at a minimum you have to be paying so that you're responsible and not damaging your credit. B is any extra amount you might choose to be paying because you want to get the debt paid back faster, you want to reduce the amount of interest that's accruing, and perhaps for other reasons. For example, you want to keep building your credit score. Now, paying back debt faster does divert money away from other purposes, but you certainly would not be diverting money away from paying back your credit cards to be investing because the interest rates on credit cards, generally speaking, are above 20%. And you could not reasonably expect to get anywhere near 20% rates of return legally by investing. So particularly in terms of credit card debt, you want to pay that back as fast as you can. You want to try to make sure you're paying the full amount owed, not just the minimum amount due. But when it comes to other debts, for example, a mortgage on a house where the interest rates are much lower, now you may decide, well, I'm going to be making that minimum payment, so I'm being responsible, but I'm going to use the extra money I have to be building financial security and wealth. I'm willing to take some time to pay back that mortgage. The point is, at a minimum, you have to be paying what's billed so you don't damage your credit. And the lender may be offering you automatic options whereby each month on the due date, the minimum amount due is automatically paid or collected from your checking or savings account. And if you're paying extra, you should always be able to target it whichever debt is most important to target. For example, the debt with highest interest. And again, if you have credit card debt, you want to try to get that paid off as fast as possible. Now, what about managing financial risk? We all face financial uncertainty in our lives, regardless of where we may live in the world. Uncertainty about our income, uncertainty about our expenses. And certainly the COVID pandemic was an example of how that affected everyone worldwide in terms of, creating real financial uncertainty for people. Insurance helps protect you from financial risk and liability. So what is personal insurance? And this is taken from a site online called investopedia.com. Insurance is a contract or a policy, and this is within the United States, but it probably is very similar in other countries as well. Insurance is a contract or a policy with an insurance provider in which you receive financial protection or reimbursement against losses from that insurance company. Most people have some form of insurance. For example, if you want to drive a car in the United States, you need to have insurance. If you have a home or you have property or possessions, you want to protect them against loss. That's what insurance does. In healthcare, healthcare in the United States is very expensive and it's not automatically provided by the government. You want to make sure you have insurance to cover the cost of healthcare, because if you don't, it could be catastrophic. And over the long term, you may want to be thinking about disability and life insurance, particularly if you want to be able to provide for others. Because if you have a loss of income for any reason, due to disability or a loss of life, and others are dependent upon you as a wage, an income and provider, then you want to make sure that they're going to be taken care of, even if you can't provide for them or for yourself. And insurance policies protect against financial losses resulting from accidents, injury, or property damage. But it also protects you against liability, legal responsibility, in the case of damage or injury that's caused to a third party. For example, if you're in a car accident where you caused the accident, then you could be liable for injuries caused to that other person. And again, that's where insurance is designed to protect you. And there are certain types of personal insurance in the United States. There's insurance that's designed to replace income. That's life insurance. This is replacing your income if you've died and yet others are dependent on that income. Now, if you're single and have no dependents, then you may not have to have life insurance if no one else is going to depend on your income that you were providing to them when you die. But you all face the possibility of disability. And you may be covered under some kind of disability insurance policy by your employer. Maybe not, but it may not be enough. But the point is, we all face the possibility of disability in the future. And if we're disabled and unable to work, how are you going to be covering your expenses? That's what disability insurance is designed to provide for. Again, your employer may be providing some disability insurance. And again, if you're working at UCSF, make sure you pay attention during orientation or check with the benefits department, because you may be eligible, you may not, depending upon your employment status as an international scholar or student. Medical and health, medical insurance, dental insurance, long-term care insurance. In the United States, this is not going to be provided automatically by the government in most cases. So you want to make sure you're accounting for that, because these can be very expensive expenses and can be catastrophic. In other countries, this may be provided by your country. Again, that's not the case here in the United States, at least currently for most people. Property and liability. Again, that's why you have auto insurance, to protect the car against damage and to protect yourself against liability if you're in an accident. Homeowners, renters, property hazard insurance. Again, protecting the property and liability. And there may be other types of insurance you need. For example, if you're a healthcare professional, you may need malpractice insurance, as an example. The point is, insurance is also a part of your financial reality if you want to protect yourself against risk. So a few final comments, and then we'll see what questions we have. Remember, our purpose here is to help you plan to manage your finances strategically, to make sure that you're in control of how you're spending your money, so that you're able to be efficient and make the best use of every dollar you have as you're managing and minimizing your risk, repaying debt, and planning for your financial future. So develop and follow a manageable budget or spending plan, and track your spending so that you can adjust as needed over time. Plan for your future financially by building financial security and wealth, which includes saving for emergencies, investing for retirement, and saving for other investments such as the purchase of a new home. And starting as soon as you can is best. Faster is always better when building for the financial future because of that compounding growth curve. Build and maintain good credit so that you can get the credit you need when you need it. And the best way to start is to make sure you have a credit card with a financial institution in the United States and that you're using that card, but when you're using it, you're hopefully paying the full amount owed every month, not just the minimum amount due. Repay any debt responsibly so you don't damage the credit you're trying to build, and try to make sure you minimize any debt that you have, particularly from credit cards. And protect yourself from financial risk by making sure, to the extent insurance is needed, that you're obtaining that insurance. And for more information about personal finance, there's several websites I provided: bankrate.com, consumerfinance.gov, consumer.ftc.gov, and money.cnn.com. On budgeting, there are free budget planning tools out there on the internet. There used to be a program called Mint. It's now available on creditkarma.com. Google has a budgeting tool called Google Sheets at google.com/sheets. There's another website called goodbudget.com. Your budgets probably are not that complicated where you need to be paying for a budgeting tool. You should be able to use a tool without having to pay for it. And these are some examples. If you want to learn more about the tax system and taxes in the United States, particularly at the federal level, go out to irs.gov. As an employee in California, you'll also likely have to be paying taxes in the state of California. Again, you'll learn more about through HR. If you want more information about certified financial planners, particularly once you have finished all your training and you're needing to start to think about how to plan for your financial future, and you're not exactly sure how best to do it, and you have resources that you're not sure how to be investing, that's where a financial planner may be helpful to you. And letsmakeaplan.org is a good place to start for looking for a financial planner. When it comes to insurance, to learn more in general about insurance, go to investopedia.com. That's where I put that information that I quoted from. You can also go to money.com/whatisinsurance. And remember, you want to get on target to succeed financially. You want to take control of your finances and plan for your future. So create your financial plan by starting with your budget or spending plan. Build financial security and wealth by making sure you're thinking about and contributing to that future bucket. Manage your financial risks and make sure you're building good credit by making sure you have at least one credit card with a financial institution in the United States so you can start building your credit history.
We have a lot of great content on our postdoc website, so feel free to search there for specifically what you're looking for. There's information about taxes, retirement, the pay title codes, how they're taxed differently. I did mention that UCSF housing is below market rate. Typically, a one-bedroom is about $3,200 to $3,400, and there is no security deposit required. That is one of the biggest benefits for UCSF housing. So let us know if you have other questions that you don't find the answers to in the Q&A or on our website.
We also have, thank you for that, Shaquita. We also have a survey that we're hoping to hear your feedback on. Since this is the first time we're offering it to folks, we would love to hear what you have to say, what was helpful, what areas we can expand upon. And of course, Jeff, thank you. That was really, really helpful for you to share your expertise in such a way that we could really understand. I've met with financial planners in the past and it just like flew over my head, but I appreciate your knowledge and your expertise that you've shared with us.
Absolutely. And one thing I want to just remind everyone that if they have further questions they want to ask of me individually, then you simply need to contact the International Students and Scholars Office, and they will put you in touch with me. It would be a Zoom meeting. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything. So don't hesitate if you'd like to have further discussion with me. It's confidential. I don't share any of the information we discuss with anyone at UCSF. I simply acknowledge that I did meet with you, but that's it. So don't hesitate if it would be helpful to you. And again, thank you, Holly and Shakita, for inviting me to participate in this program.
Of course, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to put my email in the chat just so that you know what it is, and you can reach out to me directly to get the information, Jeff's information. And please, please complete the survey. It would be really helpful to us. We did get funding through a wellness grant to offer this to you. And so the more good feedback we get, the more we can offer programs like this with speakers like Jeff and others who have expertise in specific areas. We hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.